Hi there, my name is Dr. Dorothy Buckley, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this video in which we will discuss autobiographical memory. So, what is autobiographical memory? Autobiographical memory is a collection of both episodic events and semantic knowledge that tells the story of a person's life. So kind of a good way to think about autobiographical memory in general is it's kind of like a scrapbook where meaningful events and facts are recorded, right? So if you're a new parent, you might have a baby book where you show a newborn photo of your baby and maybe their footprint, and then you record their weight, their height in inches, what the hospital where they were born, right? So that's semantic information or world knowledge. And you might also write a story about how, I don't know, you were in labor for 30 hours and, you know, um, they had really long hair, or they were one of 12 babies born that day or something, or like a specific event related to the birth that you want to remember, right? So that would be they're both examples of autobiographical memory, but one is kind of a piece of information devoid of a particular episode, whereas the other is a specific event that occurred at the hospital, right? So autobiographical memory is different from episodic memory in that autobiographical memory contains both events or episodes and factual information, whereas episodic memory consists only of events. So, for example, an autobiographical memory of a childhood birthday party might include images of a cake, people at the party, games being played, which are all examples of episodic memory. And it might also include knowledge about when the party occurred, where your family was living at the time in terms of like what your address was, and general knowledge maybe from your schemas or concepts talking about what typically happens at a birthday party, right? So what typically happens at a birthday party is we have, hats and balloon, or a children's birthday party, I should say. We have hats and balloons and decorations, and there's a cake, and you blow out candles, and then you get presents, right? So autobiographical memory is memory for specific experiences from our life, which can include both episodic and semantic components. And one of the components of autobiographical memory is that it's multidimensional. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so now that we've talked about kind of what the general definition of autobiographical memory is, let's talk about how psychologists and neuroscientists study autobiographical memory. So one of the biggest problems in trying to scientifically study autobiographical memory is that it's difficult to know what was initially experienced, right? So whereas laboratory studies can carefully control what stimuli participants are exposed to, and also the encoding conditions in which the memories are created, in autobiographical memory studies, every person's memories will differ, and experimenters have no way of knowing whether the recall is accurate or not. So one potential solution to this problem is to record events in a diary that allows later memories to be objectively verified. So for example, Lilton in 1975 used this method to study her own autobiographical memory. She kept a diary for over 5 years, recording 2 events per day, each being briefly described and written on an index card. She tested herself each month by randomly picking out 2 index cards and deciding whether she could remember the order in which the incidents occurred and the date. Because she chose cards at random and then replaced them, she would sometimes test herself on the same incident over several occasions. And so what you see in that figure is she observed a powerful effect. The more often she was tested on the event, the better it was retained, right? So this provided further evidence for the value of retrieval practice in long-term memory, kind of analogous to the generation effect, which we talked about when we were discussing episodic memory. An alternative to the diary method is that of cued recall, a method first used by Galton in 1879. It was subsequently reintroduced by Kravitz and Schiffman in 1974, who gave their participants a word and asked them to come up with an associated autobiographical memory with that word. So, for example, if they were shown the word horse, this might evoke a memory of the first time they rode a horse. Maybe they rode a horse at like a fair or something like that. I know that when I was a child, I never rode a horse, but I did ride a llama and it spit on me, and that was traumatizing, right? So if I ever saw the word llama, I'd be able to recollect that. And this method has also been adapted to probe for memories from a given period, such as childhood, right? Or maybe a particular type of incident. So you can probe people to generate a happy memory or a sad memory or a memory from when they were 13 years old or something like that. So it's been criticized because it's sort of overly simplistic, and there's also not a lot of experimental control. And yet it's used fairly often and has led to a lot of really cool studies, particularly studies of brain imaging, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so we're going to do a little demonstration. So for the next 30 seconds, think about a memorable experience that you've had in your life. So just take about 30 seconds. And sometimes it's helpful to close your eyes while you're doing this, just so you can be less distracted by what's going on in your environment. Okay, so now I want you to think about that memory that you generated, and I want you to tell me, did it include the following components? So whatever experience you remembered, it's pretty certain that it's going to include the following components. It's going to have a visual component. So what you see when you transport yourself back in time. Auditory, what were people saying or other sounds in your environment? Sensory information, smells, taste, touch. Spatial information, right? So one of the hallmarks of autobiographical memory, because it is partly episodic, is mental time travel and also sort of reliving or re-experiencing the event as it happens, right? Emotional valence, having positive or negative emotional responses, right? So that's what I mean when I say that autobiographical memory is multidimensional, right? There's visual and auditory and sensory information, there's spatial information, there's an emotional component, right? So another way of thinking about it is that autobiographical memory representations are incredibly, incredibly rich and robust. So one example I can get from my family is my father grew up in Wisconsin, and he was in a family of 8 kids, And while he was growing up, he had a number of electrical fires that started, and actually 3 different homes that he was living in, because they were fairly old houses. And so if my father were to recollect his earliest memory of the first fire he experienced, right, he would likely remember as a kid seeing puffs of smoke, kind of having it as he inhaled the smoke, feeling it sort of going through his nose and kind of irritating his throat and making him cough. Maybe his eyes stung a little bit, right? He could remember feeling his heart beating erratically in his chest, maybe remember his hands, on his hands, perspiring, right? And feeling and seeing himself walk toward the door and feel the doorknob and see that it was hot, right? And then maybe opening his bedroom door and walking down the hallway, and going to each of his siblings' rooms and gathering them up and trying to safely escort them from the home, and all of the emotions that would come with that, the feeling of fear, of loss of control, of anxiety, things like that. Right? So that's what I mean when I say autobiographical memory is multi-dimensional. And one interesting thing that psychologists have discovered is that vision is particularly important in terms of how it helps to create autobiographical memories. So, for example, patients who have lost their ability to recognize or either recognize objects in their environment or create mental representations of a visual object, they can experience pretty significant detriments in autobiographical memory. And this may occur because the visual stimuli were not available to serve as retrieval cues for memories, right? So we know from our discussion of episodic memory how important having access to the appropriate retrieval cues is if we're thinking about the probability of being able to successfully recollect something. But interestingly, even when the memories were not based in the visual system, they were still very, very difficult to retrieve for these particular patients. So over the last 2 decades, a growing body of research has sought to address the brain mechanisms of autobiographical memory, including both imaging studies and studies with neuropsychological patients. Some important general lessons are emerging from this work about what brain areas are important to remembering our personal past. Consider, for example, a recent meta-analysis of autobiographical memory studies using neuroimaging in healthy participants. In this meta-analysis, they combined the data from 79 different fMRI experiments with over 1,400 participants who were instructed to retrieve personal experiences using the probe method. The results of this meta-analysis were that, in general, when people retrieve autobiographical memories in response to cues, it activates a consistent set of brain regions, including both the left and right hippocampi and the parahippocampal cortex. And this isn't particularly surprising if we consider the case of H.M. or Henry Molaison, who suffered significant anterograde amnesia after these structures were removed, right? However, structures other than the hippocampus are equally important for the retrieval of autobiographical memories, right? So autobiographical retrieval also requires structures such as the posterior midline cortex and the parietal occipital sulcus. So these regions have been important for everything from spatial memory to memory for contextually rich or multi-dimensional events. So that structure is involved in the recollection of the visual and spatial features of autobiographical memories. So, for example, Sheldon and colleagues found that in healthy participants, differences in the ability to recall sensory details of their autobiographical memories were related to how effectively this particular region interacted with the hippocampus. Perhaps successful interactions between the parahippocampus and this region might explain some of the deficits in autobiographical memory that we'll talk about. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex also appears to be critical in allowing us to retrieve autobiographical memories. And this is more because of the semantic component, particularly schemas, right? So given that retrieving autobiographical memories relies on semantic knowledge such as schemas, the involvement of this region makes sense, right? So, for example, Carissa and colleagues studied 92 patients with damage to varying parts of the brain. They related these patients' performance on an autobiographical memory test to each voxel within the brain to determine whether damage to each voxel predicted test performance. They found that memory for personal semantics relied heavily on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and other regions in the back, right? So in contrast, memory for episodic details of events relied on other regions, right? So given that we have a clearly emerging picture of brain areas involved in autobiographical memory, right? Let's talk about some neuropsychological data, right? So some people have what's called severely deficient autobiographical memory, despite being otherwise healthy and high functioning. So several cases were studied by Palumbo and colleagues, and one of the people that they studied was a professor by the name of Nicholas Watkins, a physicist at the University of Warwick, who has subsequently written eloquently about his personal experience, right? So I have a quote for you down on the slide. So those who have severely deficient autobiographical memory, their deficits are kind of manifest in the way that they experience various things. So let's actually read this excerpt. So it says, severely deficient autobiographical memory, meanwhile, is manifest in the way I experience the past and the future. When I think about past events in my life, I am aware that I was there and frequently aware of details that are personal and not told to me by others. I may also be aware of where people are sitting relative to me and what color their clothes were. I saw the film Vertigo a few days ago and still have a sense of the rich redness of the restaurant from the scene where James Stewart first sees Kim Novak. I have a feeling that can form and store some sort of unseen quasi-spatial memories. What I don't have is the experience that people describe of feeling that they are back in another time and reliving it. This doesn't mean that I am troubled by the past or future, quite the opposite. It just means that the past really is another country to which I have no passport. Like A.E. Housman, I can feel nostalgia for the land of lost content, the happy highways where I went and cannot come again. But unlike him, I don't see the land shining plain. I do certainly feel often that I have something in memory. I do certainly feel I often have something in memory that is at the same time stronger and more personal than a semantic fact and weaker than a full-blown episodic recall experience. I certainly don't feel that I am living in the third person or stuck in time. Another one of the participants in the study was Susie McKinnon, and she describes a much more stark condition in which all remnants of episodic autobiographical memory appear to be absent. In an interview with the Star newspaper, she reported that she only realized her memory was different when she was 21, when helping out a friend on a class assignment in which they had to devise a quiz to detect early signs of dementia. Her friend noted that her responses to the questions on the quiz were fairly unusual, which prompted her to ask about their experiences of remembering past episodes. She was stunned by their replies. "I just assumed everyone was making up stories because I certainly was," she says, adding she thought that this was an accepted part of social interaction. You just think up funny little stories and just keep telling them over and over and over again, and that makes them true for you. McKinnon also said that because she couldn't replay mental movies of her past, she simply invented stories with lots of colorful details, some entirely wrong, or instead told stories she had overheard others tell. Sometimes she would base the stories on photos she had seen. When asked if she remembers her high school prom, she said, "If you ask me about prom, I know that I didn't go to prom, and I know that I decorated for prom. But that's different from remembering anything about it." Right? So she apparently was able to commit these facts about herself to memory upon being told them by others. Now that she realizes the ways in which she is different from others, she is happy to have a greater understanding of herself. But she is also untroubled about her memory deficit, though she occasionally feels sad when she hears her friends relating memories from the past. Palumbo and colleagues conducted a wide range of cognitive and neuropsychological tests on the 3 participants, and also performed EEG and fMRI studies. All 3 participants were in the normal range or higher on nearly all standardized tests. Indeed, they had high, normal to superior intellectual abilities on both verbal and nonverbal IQ measures. Their language and working memory performance was also normal, and their memory performance on standard verbal tests with stories or word lists was average to superior. However, laboratory tests did reveal a pattern of memory deficits that help better characterize the disorder. For example, when their visual memory was tested with the Ray complex figure test, in which they had to reproduce a complex figure after a 30-minute delay, they were severely impaired. In contrast, when asked to simply copy the figures when they were directly in front of them, they did perfectly fine, illustrating that there was not a problem with visual perception or dexterity. Second, when given humorous word definition pairs, such as a talkative featherbrain parakeet, to study either auditorially or visually, they showed an interesting dissociation. After 30 minutes and also 24 hours, they showed largely intact recognition and cued recall of the words when given the definition. In contrast, when they were asked 24 hours later to choose whether they heard or saw the information, they were severely impaired, particularly when the item was one that they saw. Moreover, when a remember no judgment was required, participants rarely claimed to consciously remember the event of being presented with the information. In tests of their autobiographical memory, participants could often recall facts about past memories, especially more recent ones, but their subjective ratings of the ability to visualize the memories was essentially at the floor for nearly all time periods explained. Right? So what does this tell us? Taken together, these findings suggest that participants' memory deficits are related most strongly to visual perceptual information that would ordinarily form the basis of autobiographical memory recollection. Right? So what is it about these participants that makes it so hard for them to experience remembering of autobiographical memories? Although much work remains to be done, Palumbo's initial explanations with fMRI were very revealing. So when recalling autobiographical memories in the scanner, participants showed significant reductions in core brain regions that have been associated with autobiographical memory retrieval, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior midline regions, right? So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is associated again with schemas and consolidating episodic experiences. A lot of these brain regions are also associated with visual memory, right? So it makes sense that those areas would show less activation. But perhaps the most intriguing feature of these participants is the extent to which their daily life was untroubled by the severity of their condition. Clearly, they had developed solutions over the course of their development that enabled them to cope very well with the everyday demands of life, and even to be somewhat unaware of how different they are. It's important to emphasize that these participants are one extreme of the spectrum of autobiographical memory, and there are a range of abilities that exist. So now that we've talked about people who have severe deficits in autobiographical memory, let's talk a little bit about people that have a vastly superior autobiographical memory. So there's a condition known as hyperthymesia, or highly superior autobiographical memory, abbreviated HSAM. And that is a condition that leads people to be able to remember an abnormally large number of their life experiences in vivid detail. It is exceedingly rare, with only 60 people in the world having been diagnosed with the condition as of 2021. American neurobiologist Elizabeth Parker, Larry Cahill, and James McDowell identified two defining characteristics of hyperthymesia: spending an excessive amount of time thinking about one's past and displaying an extraordinary ability to recall specific events from one's past. And the word hypothymesia actually derives from the ancient Greek, hyper meaning excessive and thymesis meaning remembering, right? And there's been some interesting case studies on individuals with HSAM. One video I encourage you to watch, or person I encourage you to read about, is Jill Price. So she's an individual that has hyperthymesia, and she actually participated in that study of McGow and colleagues that led them to that conclusion. So essentially the researchers concluded from studying people with HSAM or hyperthymesia that it's sort of a condition that is created in the same way that obsessive compulsive disorder develops. So if you spend a lot of time ruminating about specific memories, essentially you kind of rewire your neurobiological machinery such that you're able to create these very, very robust and long-lasting memories. Was essentially the explanation, and it's not a widely accepted explanation. There's still some debate about it, but that's one possibility. Another example of a well-known case study is the woman that you see on the slide. So her name is Mary Lou Henner, and she is a well-known actress and dancer who starred in a lot of TV shows and movies in the 1970s. And in 2010, Henner revealed in an interview with 60 Minutes that she has hyperthymesia and is able to remember in detail each day of her life going back decades. right? So this is an example. So to illustrate to the interviewer that she did meet the criteria for this condition, she took them through her shoe closet and picked up different pairs of shoes and told the reporter when she got them, when she first wore them, and what day of the week it was. So for example, she explained, I first wore these shoes on October the 7th, 2007. These I wore on April the 21st of this year. It was a Tuesday, and these I got in 1982, April 9th. It was a Friday. The next day, Hinner was interviewed on the early show, and during the interview described the process of recalling these events using the analogy of a DVD with the Select a Scene feature on. So Hinner explains that when she recalls a year, for example, she sees each of the days of the year mapped out in a sequence, and she is able to access whichever day she chooses. The interviewer asked Hinner to talk about the year 1975. The first thing she recalled is that her birthday was on Sunday, April 6th, that Christmas was on Thursday, and that Thanksgiving was on November 27th. As she thinks about more about the year, more details are filled in. She recalls a first date with a new boyfriend on August 12th and rehearsals for her first Broadway show. Hinner tells an interviewer that the experience is like time travel. While she is explaining the experience, she recalls what outfit she wore on that first date, which was on a Tuesday, and explains that while she remembers exciting first dates and Broadway rehearsals, she also remembers mundane details. Her autobiographical memory is highly accurate for all events in her life. So hyperthymesia is an extremely rare condition that was first identified in 2006. Experts on the subject have only identified, like I said, 60 people as of 2021 who have hyperthymesia. And another thing that's interesting, by the way, about hyperthymesia is while they have exceptional autobiographical memory, their memory for facts and semantic memories is average or normal, right? And their working memory is normal, and all of their other types of memory outside of autobiographical memory is normal. So it's very much an isolated thing, right? So hyperthymesia, or highly superior autobiographical memory, is a condition that leads people to be able to recall a lot of their life experiences in vivid detail. It is extraordinarily rare, with only 60 people in the world having been diagnosed. And again, in 2006, Parker, Cahill, and McDowell identified the two major characteristics, which is spending an excessive amount of time thinking about one's past and demonstrating an extraordinary ability to recall specific events. So again, kind of their hypothesis is it might mimic OCD in some ways, in that this excessive rumination creates very rich memories that are robust against forgetting. So one interesting way to think about autobiographical memory is to consider how it's represented in films. And one excellent representation of these kind of processes would be the film Forrest Gump, right? So the film Forrest Gump tells the story of a simple man living life in the mid-20th century, completely unaware of the fact that he has influenced many significant historical events. Forrest Gump fails to see the importance of events from his life because his mind is focused on one thing and one thing only: his love for Jenny and his desire to see her again, right? So although Forrest Gump's inability to see the relevance of those experiences may seem to depict a person with disrupted autobiographical memory, the movie actually portrays autobiographical memory extremely well. A person's autobiographical memory and the significance that person ascribes to different life events is not fixed. It is related to her or his self-concept, which is a belief in who she or he is. When people recall events from their lives that are not closely associated with their current self-concept, they tend to feel like a bystander, watching the events happening, but not really participating in the events. For example, people recovering from addictions often recall events from when they were abusing substances as though they were happening to a different person. When Forrest recalls his life to a variety of people at the bus stop, he is not thinking of himself as a hero or a businessman or an inspiration. So when he recalls events in his life linked to these labels, he views them as happening to somebody else, as a third-party bystander. Forrest Gump's entire self-concept revolves around one thing: his love for Jenny. He sees himself as a man who has loved this girl his entire life and now gets to see her again. All of the other events that have occurred lack meaning or substance to him. When audiences are amused by Forrest's humility, what they are really seeing on the screen is a true rendering of the constructive and highly personal nature of autobiographical memory. While Forrest Gump is certainly not a scientific case study, the film portrays autobiographical memory in a thought-provoking and scientifically accurate way. So jumping off of that, what are some theories that attempt to explain how autobiographical memory works? Well, according to a very famous researcher by the name of Martin Conway, autobiographical memory is constructed within a self-memory system, or SMS, that is comprised of an autobiographical knowledge base and the working self. The autobiographical knowledge base contains knowledge of the self that can be used by the individual to determine what the self is, what the self was, and what the self can be in the future. The working self is a set of personal goals and self-images that are organized into a hierarchy. The information in the autobiographical knowledge base is categorized into 3 areas: lifetime periods, general events, and event-specific knowledge. Lifetime periods contain thematic knowledge about specific periods of life, such as maybe a person might have a school theme, or a looking for work theme, or a work theme, or a parenting theme. Lifetime periods contain information about activities, relationships, locations, and time frames associated with each of those themes. General events are more specific than lifetime periods and are comprised of either multiple representations of repeated events or a sequence of related events. General events are clusters around themes related to achieving personal goals or failing to achieve personal goals. So, for example, a person's autobiographical knowledge base may include the general event of buying my first car or getting fired from my first job at the mall. And according to Martin Conway and colleagues, general events representing first-time accomplishments, such as the first time you're driving a car or the first time you kiss a romantic partner, those things can be particularly vivid. Event-specific knowledge is highly detailed information about specific events gleaned from episodic memories. Most event-specific knowledge fades fairly quickly. However, events that mark a new beginning, events related to turning points in one's life, and anchoring events that affirm a person's beliefs, and analogous events that impact future behavior may all be better remembered, right? So as shown in the figure there, lifetime periods, general events, and event-specific knowledge form a hierarchy within the autobiographical knowledge base. So knowledge stored in lifetime periods contain cues for general events, and general events contain cues for event-specific knowledge. So according to the model, when a cue activates material in the autobiographical knowledge base that is linked to a lifetime period, a general event, or event-specific knowledge, an autobiographical memory is retrieved. When the autobiographical memory includes an episodic memory, a person may experience mental time travel, which is a sense of oneself in the past and is typically accompanied by imagery and other sorts of sensory details. And Martin Conway argues that mental time travel that often accompanies recollection of personally relevant episodic memories results from the integration of parts of the autobiographical knowledge base and the working self. So the relationship between the autobiographical knowledge base and the working self is reciprocal. The working self manipulates the cues that activate material in the autobiographical knowledge base, while the autobiographical knowledge base determines the goals and self-images associated with the working self. Thus, according to SMS theory, which was proposed by Martin Conway, episodic memory is constructed based not on a series of personally experienced episodes in chronological order, but rather based on a person's current self-image and goals. Because a person's self-image and goals change over time, autobiographical memory may also change over time. So for example, a student who takes developmental psychology in her second year of college will look back on the significance of that course differently if later studying developmental psychology in grad school than if later studying microbiology in grad school. That second year developmental course will feel like a first to the student who later specializes in the field and will feel fairly inconsequential to a person that has chosen to study something different, like microbiology. So the final component of autobiographical memory is the working self. The working self is not a level of representation. Rather, it is a monitoring function that controls the retrieval of information from the levels of representation. So the working self serves as a gateway that allows some memories to be retrieved and others to stay unretrieved. Basically, it promotes the retrieval of memories that are needed in a situation. So in particular, memories that will be helpful to the person given their current situation, right? So in this way, the working self is sort of analogous to the central executive in working memory. The working self allows for kind of the curation of working memory, right? So the working self includes the goals and self-images that make up our view of ourselves. So for example, if you think of yourself as being a light sleeper and setting high goals for yourself, right? This working self is going to be a function of those aspirations and expectations combined with your actual memory, contributing to that view of yourself, right? So many nights of being woken by the slightest sound have formed a general event in your memory of being a light sleeper. With respect to autobiographical memory, the working self functions to keep two features of memory intact: coherence and correspondence. So coherence means that processes that yield autobiographical memories must be consistent with the working self. So for example, if one's working self includes the image of oneself as an animal lover, the working self will work to yield coherent autobiographical memories of instances in which one was kind to animals, right? So when this aspect of yourself is invoked, you'll recall the time that you stopped to help a turtle cross the road, and not the time you actually ran over a rabbit, right? Correspondence, by contrast, means that retrieved memories match actual past events. So correspondence is basically looking for the truthfulness aspect, if that makes sense. So, for example, even if you think of yourself as a good baseball player, it's important to accurately remember that it was you who struck out with the bases loaded to end your team's opportunity to advance to the playoffs, right? So thus, correspondence is necessary for a person's memory to be an accurate reflection of their personal past, whereas coherence is necessary for a person's retrieval to be consistent with their self-image, right? So as all of the above examples may indicate, conflicts between coherence and correspondence may arise in circumstances in which these processes work for sort of cross purposes, right? So for example, you may want to remember your vacations as relaxed and enjoyable events. And on one vacation, however, you may have spent a long, unpleasant wait in a crowded, hot bus station, right? So the working self integrates these two conflicting aspects of the vacation into the construction of autobiographical memory, right? Okay, so to summarize, the working self is a complex knowledge structure that contributes to encoding information about what is, what has been, and what can be. To be effective, however, it needs to be both coherent and to correspond reasonably closely with reality, right? So when this link is lost, problems occur which might in extreme cases lead to confabulation or delusion, right? So Conway and Tachi in 1996, for example, describe a patient suffering from frontal lobe damage following a traffic accident who had completely false memories of comforting aspects of his life. So, for example, he confabulated the fact that he had a very loving and supportive family, even though that wasn't the case, right? So that's an example of a failure of correspondence, and sort of the working self trying to sort of lead to a more favorable interpretation of events that was consistent with the self, right? So the autobiographical knowledge base is proposed to have a hierarchical structure with an overall life story being linked to various themes, right? So for example, you might have a theme for when I was an undergraduate, my first job, my hopes for the future, and these comprise a number of general events which can include individuals as well as different activities, right? So for example, the psychology department, Professor Smith, departmental talks, promotion, right? So these are all still conceptualized at a very abstract level, but can lead to specific episodic memories as well, right? So for example, my interview with Professor Smith on applying for a job, or the last departmental research talk I heard, right? So these in turn might have been stored at a more fundamental level, containing more detailed information, right? So again, one of the characteristics, right, of autobiographical memory is the process of re-experiencing an event, right? So actually watching yourself experience the event again, which is where that component of episodic memory comes in. So one important question to answer is, why do we need autobiographical memory, right? Or what is the purpose of autobiographical memory? So Williams, Conway, and Cohen wrote a very famous paper in 2008 where they proposed 4 functions of autobiographical memory. So these include directive functions. So for example, what happened the last time you tried to change a car tire, and perhaps so that you can, direct your future behavior, right? And also a more social function, right? So directive function is kind of for the purpose of being useful for correcting future behavior. And then there's also a social function. So sharing autobiographical memories can be very pleasant, and it can be a socially supportive activity, right? So one of the first things that we talk about when we meet new people is we talk about, previous experiences that we've had, and it's a way of building kind of emotional intimacy with someone, right? So there's a directive function in terms of autobiographical memory and having kind of a running sort of video in your head of your past mistakes and things that you've done well in the past, right, can inform your future behavior. The social function of sharing your autobiographical memories can improve your sort of emotional intelligence and ability to connect with other people, right? And that can be one of the reasons why individuals like Henry Molaison, for example, and other people that are densely amnesic or suffer from Alzheimer's or dementia, a lot of times there's a breakdown of personal relationships because they can no longer sort of connect by or with these shared experiences, right? Autobiographical memories can also play an important role in creating and maintaining our self-representation, right? So hence the value of things like reminiscence therapy, right? So we'll talk about this actually next week. But reminiscence therapy is basically a process whereby elderly patients with memory problems are encouraged to build up a set of reminders of their early life, right? So they might be encouraged to create a scrapbook with photographs and other personal mementos to help them sort of awaken memories of their younger days. We can also, have them listen to music or be placed in a special environment that has, the decor of the period in which they, the whatever period they grew up in. So maybe a 1930s kitchen with a very similar stove and sink and things like that. Another important function of autobiographical memory is emotional regulation, right? So recollection of autobiographical memories can be used to regulate our emotions, particularly when we need to cope with adversity or build confidence, right? But one of the problems of depression that patients often struggle with is they find it difficult to recall positive life events, whereas negative recollections are more readily available, right? And that's something that I mentioned when we talked about episodic memory. It's mood congruent memory, right? Whereas healthy individuals tend to be able to engage in nostalgia and readily sort of have this stream of positive memories associated with an early time, right? But I should say that many of these functions are largely speculative, and sort of in an attempt to get autobiographical or not autobiographical, to get empirical or scientific evidence to support some of these functions. There were actually researchers by the name of Hyman and Ferries in 1992 who questioned people about their memories, and specifically memories that they talked about a lot and the situations in which they were discussed. And they found very few reports of autobiographical memory being used to directly solve problems, and they were more readily associated with sharing advice and sharing common experiences and things like that. So they found very few reports of autobiographical memory being used directively to solve problems, with the sharing of experience and passing on of advice being far more common. In a subsequent study, they used cue words to prompt memories, finding a distinction between memories that were used internally for self-related functions and those used in interacting with others. In another experiment, Buchli and colleagues devised the Thinking About Life Experiences, or the TALE questionnaire, which specified particular situations and then categorized the resulting reports as either directive, which is again for a specific purpose, right? So trying to remember how to do something or how to behave in a specific situation. Self-related, so that would be something that is related to your self-concept. Nurturing existing social relationships, right? So this is where something like nostalgia might come in. So I don't know if you all have this experience, because you're of course much younger than me, but one of my favorite things to do if I go to like a high school reunion or I talk to a childhood friend is to talk about all of our favorite TV shows that were on like Nickelodeon or the Disney Channel when those things, were first invented. And how much better they are than kids' TV nowadays. So that would be an example of nurturing existing social relationships, is kind of sharing common experiences in your autobiographical memory for the purpose of bonding, right? Or sometimes for developing new social relationships, right? So a lot of times this can be maybe something related to adversity, right? So maybe you lost a parent when you were young, or you had a parent that was incarcerated, and so when you're building up new relationships with people, you might have that shared trauma or that shared tragedy that can help you build rapport with that person, right? And when they did a factor analysis of the results, they found considerable overlap between the directive function, the self-related function, and those related to nurturing and developing relationships, right? So even though it remains plausible that autobiographical memory has a number of different functions, it's actually unclear if they're clearly separable functions or all sort of a unifying function. So one weakness of the research described so far is the problem of adequate methodology. So the studies in this case assume, for example, that participants are aware of the function of such memories, right? Because remember, we're asking them to categorize based on these possible different functions, right? But a lot of times we don't actually know what's happening in our own mind or why we're bringing up these recollections, right? So these recollections could be driven by something completely incidental or random, such as cues that were being given, right? So we talked about that a lot in when I was talking about episodic memory, right? That memory retrieval is driven a lot by the cues in our environment, right? So it could be that rather than kind of a prescriptive sort of a directed function. So that's one of the limitations to keep in mind. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the interaction between emotion and autobiographical memory. And in particular, we're going to discuss 3 different phenomena. So we're going to start with flashbulb memories, and then we're going to talk about positivity bias, and finally we're going to talk about fading affect bias. So flashbulb memories is perhaps the most well-known example of how emotion affects memory. So the term flashbulb memories originated with Brown and Kulik in 1977. And in their sort of seminal paper about flashbulb memories, they described them as, for an instant, the entire nation and perhaps much of the world stopped to have its picture taken. So what do we mean by flashbulb memory? A person's memory for the circumstances surrounding shocking and highly charged events, right? So these are national and international crises, right? That get, kind of the world's attention, if that makes sense, right? So one thing that it's important to emphasize is that the term flashbulb memory refers to memory for how a person heard about an event, not memory for the event itself, right? And characteristics of flashbulb memories are that they are highly emotional, remembered for long periods of time, and they're very, very vivid, right? But they're also very inaccurate, right? So for example, I was born in 1987. So some of the flashbulb memories that I have created, the most obvious one, right, would be my memory of finding out about 9/11. Another example would be the Columbine shooting, which was really one of the very first school shootings in America. My mother was born in 1960, so she would have a flashbulb memory for John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King being assassinated. And again, what's critical is it's not a memory for that specific event, but rather the circumstances. So basically where you were, who you were with, sort of the episodic memory for the circumstances surrounding the event. So Brown and Kulik's study found that people were able to describe in some detail what they were doing when they heard about highly emotional events. But their procedure was flawed because their participants weren't asked what they remembered until years after the event occurred. So Brown and Kulik asked people to recollect kind of the circumstances where they were when they heard about the JFK assassination. But they didn't actually probe their memories until many, many years later. And so there was no way to verify any kind of accuracy. So the only way to check for accuracy is to compare the person's memory to what actually happened, or memory reports collected immediately after the event. So for example, Ulrich Neisser and Nicole Harsh in 1992 did a study in which they asked participants how they heard about the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Back in 1986, space launches were still considered a special event and were often highly anticipated. The flight of the Challenger was special because one of the astronauts was a high school teacher named Krista McAuliffe, and she was the first member of NASA's Special Teacher in Space project. So the blastoff from Cape Canaveral on January 28, 1986, first started out very routine, but unfortunately 77 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger broke apart and plummeted into the ocean, killing the crew of 7, including the teacher. So this is an example of a highly emotional event that might form a flashbulb memory. So Neisser and Harsh asked participants how they heard about the explosion, and participants filled out a questionnaire the day after the explosion, and again either 2.5 or 3 years later. So this is an example of someone's recollection the day after the Challenger exploded. I was in my religion class, and some people walked in and started talking about it. I didn't know any details except that it had exploded and the school teacher students had been watching it, which I thought was so sad. Then after class, I went to my room and watched the TV program talking about it, and I got all the details from that, right? So that's the initial recollection of the event, which we would expect to be fairly accurate because it had been, just 24 hours since the event. This is the same participant trying to recollect the circumstances surrounding the event 2.5 years later. When I first heard about the explosion, I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate and we were watching TV. It came on a news flash and we were both totally shocked. I was really upset and went upstairs to talk to a friend of mine, and then I called my parents, right? So this recollection is totally different, right? It's very, very vivid. It's highly emotional, and there's all of these sort of fake details or incorrect details that have been infused in this recollection that were not there in the first questionnaire, right? So right after the explosion, only 21% of the participants indicated that they had first heard about it on TV, but 2.5 years later, 45% of the participants reported that they had first heard about it on TV, right? So reasons for the increase in TV memories could be that TV reports become more memorable through repetition, and that TV is a major source of news, right? So our semantic knowledge, right, our schema tells us that most often, or at least this was the case in the early 1990s, right? It was the case that if you wanted to find out what was going on in the world, you would watch TV, right? So it's a fair inference for people later to assume that that's where they found out about various events. TV broadcasts are also very vivid and highly emotional, right? We all know that videos of tragedies play on, CNN and NBC and other news channels kind of on a constant loop, right? People who lived during 9/11 or were alive during 9/11, like myself, can remember footage of the Twin Towers falling was probably played around that time thousands of times, right? So one of the reasons why why flashbulb memories are so often tied to the television is because of the fact that we have repetitive news broadcasts that are very, very sort of vivid and rich in those kinds of sensory details. So why do flashbulb memories exist? One hypothesis is called the narrative rehearsal hypothesis. So it essentially posits that we may remember events like those that happened on 9/11 or the Challenger disaster, not because of a special mechanism, but because we rehearse those events after they occur. Right? So the narrative rehearsal hypothesis makes sense when we consider that the events that followed 9/11, right? Pictures of the planes crashing into the World Trade Center were played endlessly on TV, and the event and its aftermath were covered extensively for months and months and months in the media, right? So James Ost and colleagues in 2002 asked participants to respond to the following statement. Have you seen the paparazzi's video recording the car crash in which Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Fade lost their lives? Of the 45 people who responded to this question, 20 said that they had seen the film. This was, however, impossible because no such film exists. The car crash was reported on TV, but never actually shown. So the extensive media coverage of this event apparently caused some people to remember something, seeing the film, that didn't actually occur, right? So that kind of supports the narrative rehearsal hypothesis as well. So another really interesting phenomenon in autobiographical memory is something known as the positivity bias. So memory for emotional autobiographical events is often remembered more easily than memory for neutral events. However, over time, negative memories are not nearly remembered as well as positive memories for most people. So the disproportionate accessibility or the ease of recall for positive memories relative to negative or neutral autobiographical memories over time is referred to as the positivity bias. So the positivity bias was first documented by Waldvogel in 1948. So his study was essentially pretty simple. He gave participants about an hour and a half to write down as many memories as they could remember from the first 8 years of their childhood, and he asked them to rate them as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And what he found is that participants rated 50% of their events as pleasant, 30% as unpleasant, and 20% as neutral. In a much more recent study, Swadefeld and Ike in 1995 did this really interesting and somewhat surprising experiment where they utilized a sensory deprivation tank. So they asked participants to float quietly in this sensory deprivation tank for a full hour, relaxing peacefully. And after the hour was up, he asked them to recall 12 memories while they were still floating and rate each memory for pleasantness. And he found that participants rated their recalled events as pleasant about 66% of the time, much more often than unpleasant, which was about 33% of the time. In another experiment, Bernstein in 1996 asked participants to keep a diary of memories that involuntarily popped into their mind, noting each memory as soon as it occurred, right? So this was kind of an early precursor to Western conceptualizations of mindfulness, right? So just note the memory and let it sort of wash over you, right? So he found that such memories are generally triggered by stimuli in the immediate environment and occur automatically, right? So they are likely to reflect they are unlikely to reflect voluntary memory research, right? So they're kind of reflexive in nature. And here too, even when participants weren't exerting effort per se to retrieve those spontaneous memories, he found that the memories were positively biased. So 49% of the events were positive, 32 were neutral, and only 19 were negative. So it seems that our neural cognitive systems are biased to allow us to more often recall positive memories than either negative or neutral memories. And we find that even when neutral cue words are used or probe words, So even when we give people words like pool and medicine, and participants are explicitly asked to recall either a positive or negative memory and given a full 25 seconds per cue, they are reliably less able to recall negative memories compared to positive memories. So this shows that the positivity bias is not merely a tendency to favor reporting positive memories over negative ones, but it actually reflects difficulty in accessing them. Fortunately for us, bad memories are not nearly as strong as good memories. So this is reflected in a highly counterintuitive but very well documented phenomenon known as the fading effect bias in autobiographical memory. So put simply, events that make us feel good, right, when they happen to us, tend to continue to feel good even when they're recalled much later, right? So positive memories continue to retain that positive emotional valence, but events that make us feel bad when they happen tend to not sting or hurt us very much, as much when they're later remembered. Right? So thus, across time, the negative emotions that we feel for bad autobiographical memories fades much more rapidly than does the positive emotions associated with good memories, right? So I have a graph there for you, and it's based on an experiment by Walker and colleagues in 1997. And so basically what they did is what the graph shows is the average reduction in emotional rating between the initial recording of an event in autobiographical memory and a delayed assessment of emotional intensity. So they had participants record the events and describe on a scale from like 1 to 9 how intense the negative, the pleasant or unpleasant emotions associated with each event was. And then they asked them to again recollect the memory and rate the emotional intensity after a delay of 3.5 months, 1 year, or 4 years. And what they found is that in general, unpleasant memories were perceived as losing more emotional intensity over time than positive ones, which illustrates the fading effect bias. Okay, so this is another sort of graph showing the same thing. And it basically shows that the fading effect bias, or the greater reduction in emotional intensity for negative memories over time, occurs regardless of participants' overall beliefs about how emotional intensity of experiences changes over time, right? So one criticism of the data from the previous graph could be that maybe there's a demand characteristic, or maybe participants' beliefs about what happens to negative memories over time might influence this effect, right? So if the person is depressed, or if they have kind of a negative worldview affected by trauma or something like that, maybe they would be less likely to see that reduction in emotional intensity. But the strongest piece of evidence that this is actually a neurocognitive mechanism is that beliefs don't affect it at all, right? So irrespective of participants' overall beliefs about how emotional intensity of experience changes over time, we still see a significant drop in emotional intensity for negative events over time. So what this suggests is that The fading effect bias actually does reflect a true change in emotion associated with individual memories, rather than a simple bias, right, or attempt to match one's ratings to a general belief about memory and emotion. So basically, this is a hardwired, a characteristic of our hardwired innate sort of memory mechanisms. Okay, so another interesting question with respect to autobiographical memory is how autobiographical memory might change across a lifetime, right? So what determines which particular life events we will remember better years later, right? Well, personal milestones like graduating from college or getting a marriage proposal stand out, as do highly emotional and traumatic events such as surviving a violent crime, surviving a serious illness, or surviving a car accident. So, one of the well-documented phenomena in autobiographical memory is something called the reminiscence bump. So a particularly interesting result occurs when participants over 50 are asked to remember events in their lives. Events are remembered for all years between the ages of 5 and 55, but memory is better for recent events and for events occurring between the ages of 10 and 30, right? So I want you to think to yourself why events prior to the age of 5 might be less accessible. So the reason why events prior to the age of 5 are less accessible is due to something called infantile amnesia, right? And so basically what infantile amnesia reflects is the fact that after the age of 5, most, if not all, humans are fluent in their native language, right? And once you become fluent in any language, that dramatically changes the contents of your semantic memory and all of your knowledge structures, right? And it rewires them to such a significant degree that you can't have a thought without that thought being converted into some kind of linguistic code, right? We always have our internal narrator sort of running and putting our thoughts into words, right? We can't really differentiate between a thought and a word, right? The difference is just one is spoken out loud as in, vocal speech, and one is said in your head, right? So that's why infantile amnesia occurs, is that once we are at the age of 5, all of our knowledge structures have been changed to linguistic ones instead of pre-linguistic ones, which is what babies come into the world with. Okay, so a prominent feature of probing autobiographical memories is their distribution across the lifespan, right? So when left free to recall memories from any period of their life, all healthy participants, whether young or old, tend to recall few autobiographical memories from the first year of life, termed infantile amnesia, and they also tend to produce plenty of memories from the most recent period, right? So those over the age of 40, however, also show a marked increase in memories from the period between the age of 15 and 30, the so-called reminiscence bump. A cross-cultural study illustrated in this figure shows a similar pattern across participants from China, Japan, Bangladesh, England, and the US. However, there are some cultural differences in the average date for the first memory, which occurs at an average age of 3.8 for people from the US and 5.4 for participants from China. And this might actually reflect differences in the way mothers talk to their children across these cultures, right? So US parents interact in a way that tends to be more elaborate and emotionally oriented and focused on the past, whereas parents in China tend to focus on the past, right? So this might account for a tendency for U.S. recollections of early memories to be longer and more elaborate and more emotionally valenced and self-focused than occurs with Chinese respondents, whose recollections tend to be briefer and have a stronger collective rather than individualistic focus. Okay, so now we're going to do a little activity, okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to write 3 I am statements that describe who you are as a person. So if I was writing this, I would say, I am a teacher, I am a scientist, I am a daughter, I am a warrior. Okay, those are the statements that I would use to answer the question, who am I? Right? Okay. So basically, there are 3 hypotheses that attempt to explain the reminiscence bump, or why memory is better for events occurring between the ages of about 10 and 30, or 15 and 30, depending on who you ask. Right? It depends sort of when that maturation process associated with puberty begins, right? So there are 3 hypotheses, and we'll start with the first one, which is the self-image hypothesis. Okay. So the self-image hypothesis proposes that memory is enhanced for events that occur as a person's self-image or identity is being formed. Based on the results of an experiment in which participants with an average age of 54 created I am statements, such as I am a mother or I am a psychologist, that they felt defined them as a person. The average age they assigned to the origin of these statements and related events was 25, which is within the span of the reminiscence bump. So development of the self-image therefore brings with it numerous memorable events, most of which happen during adolescence or childhood, right? Or adolescence or young adulthood, right? So the self-image hypothesis says that the reason why we better remember events associated with late adolescence and young adulthood is because those events happened around the time that our identity was being formed. And because, as we've already discussed, right, the self-image or self-concept is integral to autobiographical memory, it makes sense that those memories would be given preferential focus and therefore would be more easily retrieved. A second hypothesis, the cognitive hypothesis, proposes that periods of rapid change that are followed by stability cause stronger encoding of memories. So adolescence and young adulthood fit this description because the rapid changes, such as going away to college, getting married, or starting your first career, these rapid changes that occur during these periods are followed by the relative stability of adult life, right? So we remember these events associated with the reminiscence bump, not because they're integral in the formation of our identity, but because they're very much periods of intense change followed by a lot of stability, right? So one way to think about it is the reminiscence bump is created when you're doing all sorts of new and interesting things, right, as a young person, and then that is immediately followed by a long period of sort of boring, unchanging events that characterizes adulthood, right? So what evidence do we have that supports the cognitive hypothesis? Well, one piece of evidence comes from various studies of people immigrating from to the U.S. from different countries, right? So one way this hypothesis has been tested is by finding people who have experienced rapid changes in their life that occurred at a time later than adolescence or young adulthood, right? So the cognitive hypothesis would predict that the reminiscence bump should occur later for those people. So for example, they looked at people that immigrated at the age of 20 and 24, and they found the same reminiscence bump, right, as you would for people that hadn't immigrated in the United States, because that's the same period associated with the identity changes, right? But for people that immigrated at the age of 34 and 35, right, there was a shift in the reminiscence bump. So the reminiscence bump occurred later, and that supports the cognitive hypothesis. So now I want you to think about the average age at which each of the following events typically occur for individuals living in the U.S. So think about falling in love for the first time. Think about having children. What is the average age associated with that? What about getting married? Okay, so that all relates to something called the reminiscence bump, or excuse me, the cultural life script hypothesis. And basically, the cultural life script hypothesis distinguishes between a person's life story, which is all of the events that have occurred in the person's life, and a cultural life script, which is the culturally expected events that occur at a particular time in the lifespan. And so basically, the idea is that events that you remember are those that fit into that cultural life script, right? And a lot of the most culturally significant events occur between the ages of 15 and 30, right? So when Bernstein and Rubin in 2004 asked people to list when important events in a typical person's life occur, some of the most common responses were falling in love at 16 years of age, going to college or graduating from college at 22 years, marriage at 27 years. Keep in mind, this was 20 years ago, right? So some of those things have been delayed quite a bit. Having children, 28 years. Again, the typical age for those things now, I believe it is much higher. But at that time, it was about 28 years. Okay, so the idea is that many of the culturally scripted events that are the events that our culture ascribes as being significant occur during the developmental stages in which the reminiscence bump occurs, right? So events in a person's life story become easier to recall when they fit in the cultural life script for that person's culture. So for example, Gluck and Bluck, I'm not lying about those names, Gluck and Bluck in 2007 further elaborated on this life narrative or cultural narrative hypothesis. So they collected a total of 3,541 life events from 659 participants between the ages of 50 and 90 years old. And then they asked participants to rate their memories on emotional valence, their personal importance, and the extent to which the rememberer felt like they had control over those events. A reminiscence bump was found, but only for positive events over which participants felt they had a high degree of control, a result that they interpret as consistent with the importance of autobiographical memory in creating a positive life narrative. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and start talking about the relationship between music and autobiographical memory. So a common experience for most people is hearing an old song on the radio, for example, that elicits a memory. So perhaps a memory of dancing with your date at the prom, or maybe having a shared song between you and a significant other, right? And the song seems to transport you back in time, and you relive kind of the happy moment associated with that song. So one of the first researchers to investigate this was Wanada et al. In 2007. So they collected a large selection of music from popular sources. So they downloaded the 100 top 100 songs from iTunes for the previous few years. And then they played a series of 30-second excerpts of the songs to students and asked the students to report any autobiographical memories associated with each song. And they found that more than 30% of the songs elicited autobiographical memories for the participants, and most of those memories were highly emotional in nature, and the vast majority of them were associated with positive affect or emotion. And the researchers found that most memories that the songs elicited that most of the memories were event-specific memories, but some songs also elicited general events or lifetime periods. Many of the songs also elicited feelings of nostalgia, okay, which is a longing for an earlier, better time in the past, right? So this study confirms the idea that music, particularly songs, can be a powerful retrieval cue for autobiographical memories. And it also makes sense, right, that we would see music as a beneficial retrieval aid for individuals with Alzheimer's, for example. Okay. And not only does music act as a powerful cue for autobiographical memories, odor can also be a powerful cue, and it can elicit feelings of nostalgia, right? So the strong sense of longing for the past that is often elicited by odors is consistent with nostalgia. And Reed and colleagues examined the experience of nostalgia after participants sniffed a variety of odors. And they found that the odors frequently unlocked a sense of nostalgia, and that such odor-induced nostalgia was associated with a sense of well-being, positive emotion, and optimism. And not only did these odors elicit feelings of optimism, right? They also were associated with a number of other events as well. So for example, Willander and Larson in 2007 conducted a fascinating study on the role odors play in autobiographical memory, finding that odors can create powerful memory effects. They tested 3 conditions. In one condition, they presented odors alone and asked participants to report the first autobiographical memory they experienced. In a second condition, they presented the names of the odors as words without the smell accompanying them. And in the third condition, they presented the names of the odors as well as the actual odors. And as expected, the name-only condition produced the fewest and the least emotional autobiographical memories. However, the odor alone condition actually produced more older and more emotionally valenced autobiographical memories than did the odor and name condition. So not only did odors elicit more autobiographical memories than the odor names did, but including the names with the odors actually interfered with the retrieval of memories. So odors seem to create different patterns in autobiographical memories than do cue words. So, for example, the cue word technique produces the reminiscence bump, the characteristic increase in memories for late childhood to early adulthood. Presenting odors, however, has a different effect on memory. Willander and Larson found that presenting odors and asking for the first memory that came to mind produced mostly memories from earlier in childhood, with most of the memories clustering before the age of 10. In another study, Hertz in 2004 showed that autobiographical memories produced by odor cues were given higher emotional ratings than were autobiographical memories elicited by either visual cues or auditory cues. Interestingly, these effects are typically bigger in women than in men. And Zuko and colleagues in 2012 found that odors were more likely to elicit autobiographical memories in women than in men. And more recently, in 2019, Hackelander recently summarized the literature on this topic, right? And the bottom line is that it is true, odors do elicit old and emotional memories. Right? Okay, so that concludes our discussion of autobiographical memory. Thank you so much for your patience and for your attention. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you have a great day.